Let's begin. So in my humble opinion, this is really one of the key topics for energy decarbonization, the conversations that you're about to hear today. And we're really very pleased to bring this discussion. As you know, the US now has a goal to get to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. And we now, of course, have the Inflation Reduction Act that makes a big investment in clean energy. And these investments will then lower renewable energy prices. And that will raise the question of what will happen to energy efficiency when its main billing to date, and I think needs an update, has been the least cost resource. So according to IPCC reports, whether we can achieve an affordable and therefore achievable decarbonization with multiple pathway options hinges on whether we can significantly reduce our usage and demand. But in many decarbonization discussions, some of you may have noticed that the topic of energy efficiency often goes missing. And this report, along with the presentations today, I hope will restore some balance to that discussion. So we have three presenters, Dr. Mike Spiecian, who is the lead author of the report and will present the key findings of the report. And he focuses at ACEEE on practices and policies to maximize efficiency for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. He is also the co-author of the 2-volume report on ACEEE's Climate Forward Efficiency Initiative. Then we will have presentation by Paul Ormond, who is an energy efficiency engineer at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. He works on Massachusetts' efforts to improve building codes and energy policy, particularly as they relate to decarbonization of the built environment and helping develop building codes with significant peak load benefits. Then we'll have a presentation by Dr. Choke Harris, who is with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. His research focuses on the development and application of multiple building energy modeling tools, such as RESTOC and SCOUT, and also including development of high-performance building envelope components. So just a quick house rule, this webinar is being recorded, and we will have a transcript afterward. We will have all of the three presentations and then take questions afterwards. So please put your questions in the Q&A, not chat, but Q&A. And then please hold on to them and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So with that, I turn this over to Mike. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Edward. You can hear me okay? I'm off mute. Okay, good. So thank you, Edward, and of course, thank you to everyone live in attendance and all peoples of the future watching this on YouTube. Let's just get right into it. So I'd like to start with some background. Right now, the US generates about 1/5 of its electricity through renewable energy sources, and the US Energy Information Administration expects that value to rise to 40% by 2050, even if there's no additional policy support for wind or solar. And a major driver of that growth is that the cost of wind and solar resources are coming down and are increasingly cost competitive with traditional sources of generation like natural gas. And another driver is that a growing number of states and utilities have set renewable energy targets. Just for example, Connecticut has a 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 goal. And this combination of favorable economics and policy drivers will almost certainly transition some regions of the country to high renewable energy regions within the next couple of decades. And so that raised an important question that is the subject of ACEEE's newest report shown here on this slide, which just dropped this morning. You can access it on aceeee.org right off the main page. And that question is, what role, if any, should energy efficiency play in a high renewable energy future? And in a moment, I'm going to talk you through the details of our research, but I'm going to begin by sharing our conclusions. First, our analysis shows that energy efficiency has a crucial role in decarbonizing the electricity system and paving the way for a high renewable energy future. And it turns out that this result holds even if low levels of building electrification depress future electricity demand. Second, Energy efficiency provides more value the more quickly electricity generation decarbonizes, and it does this by offsetting the escalating costs of things like fossil-based energy and carbon capture under high renewable energy scenarios. And third, the energy efficiency measures with the greatest potential to avoid future energy system costs are those that reduce heating and cooling loads. So those include more efficient heat pumps, better insulation and air sealing of buildings, smart thermostats, and the adoption of heat pump water heaters. With that, let me share some details about our research methodology and how we came to arrive at these conclusions. So we came at this problem from two different perspectives, the first of which was a top-down approach in which we explored the role of energy efficiency across a set of deep decarbonization and high renewable energy pathway studies. Now, these studies are typically put together by sophisticated power system modelers who look at an array of supply and demand side resources to figure out what combinations could plausibly deliver us towards our energy and climate goals. And we found that one group of pathway studies assume energy efficiency will just have a limited business as usual role in the clean energy future. And unsurprisingly, they don't have much to say about efficiency's value. However, among the group of pathway studies that do intentionally investigate energy efficiency's role, they reach a different conclusion. That not only is energy efficiency valuable, but it is in fact a critical component of our clean energy future. Now, we get into all of this in greater detail in the report, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to share some highlights of how energy efficiency is considered within the studies that evaluate it alongside other energy resources. First up is the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, which finds that there is a substantial ambition gap between current policy trajectory and what is needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The WEO identifies key measures that can collectively help close that gap, including a relentless focus on energy efficiency. They further write, focusing on energy efficiency action is the unambiguous first and best response to simultaneously meet affordability, supply security, and climate goals, and that energy efficiency should be considered the first fuel of all energy transitions. Another example is Princeton's Net Zero America study, which considers efficiency technologies that are commercially available at scale in the US. And this study concludes that end-use efficiency improvements and electrification across all sectors are critical for reducing the required build-out of the energy supply system to deliver the energy needed to meet the given level of energy service demands. We also looked at a few regional studies. Massachusetts wants to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050, and their modeling found that the three of the strategies common to all net zero pathways were increased energy efficiency, electrification, and decarbonizing electricity. They also found that energy efficiency measures will become more valuable over time as carbon emission limits become more stringent, such that by 2050, every dollar invested in efficiency returned $1.50 in avoided energy costs. And the final example I'll give here is a joint analysis that explored pathways to meet California's goal of meeting 100% of retail electricity sales with renewable and zero carbon resources by 2045. The study examines a wide variety of clean energy options and finds that prioritizing cost-effective energy efficiency measures remains critical as the state moves towards 100% clean electricity. Okay, so that was the top-down perspective. The second perspective that we took to examine this question was a bottom-up perspective in which we calculated the electricity system costs that could be avoided by individual energy efficiency measures under a high renewable energy scenario. And those costs largely fall into two buckets. The cost of energy that you no longer need to purchase because of energy efficiency, and the cost of capacity, that is power plants and infrastructure that you don't need to build and maintain because energy efficiency has reduced the maximum demand on the grid. For our methodology, we started by selecting 12 energy conservation measures that you can see here on this slide. We make the assumption that when a piece of building equipment reaches the end of its useful lifetime, that it is replaced by the more efficient option listed here in this table. So in our modeling, the residential and commercial building stocks gradually become more efficient over time, and we wind up with a data set of hourly energy savings delivered by each energy conservation measure all the way out through 2050. But to determine how much benefit these measures will have for the electric grid, we use projections of the hourly avoided energy and capacity costs over that same time period. To get these values, we use a tool created by the US National Labs called Cambium. And through Cambium, you can select a future energy scenario, and it will provide you with annual avoided costs through 2050 under that scenario. So given the nature of our particular research question, we chose a high renewable energy scenario in which US electricity sector emissions decrease 95% below 2005 levels by 2050. So by combining the energy savings data with the avoided cost data, we were able to estimate the amount of savings that could be delivered by different energy conservation measures in a high renewable energy future. And here are what the results of that process look like in Texas. So you can see each of our energy efficiency measures and packages is listed on the left side of this figure, and the length of each bar captures the annual avoided electricity system costs delivered by that efficiency measure. Each of our efficiency measures has 2 bars of avoided costs with the results in 2030 on top and the results in 2050 on bottom. And the first takeaway is that commercial efficiency measures deliver greater savings in 2030, but residential measures deliver greater savings in 2050. Now, this has to do with a number of factors, including the rates of new building construction and the rates of building equipment replacement. But what it shows is that there is more near-term savings potential in the commercial sector and more long-term savings potential in the residential sector. You'll also notice that our envelope, HVAC, and thermostat efficiency measure delivers by far the greatest savings, followed by our measure that replaces inefficient hot water heating with heat pump water heating. A third takeaway is that over the course of a year, most of the benefit of energy efficiency comes in the form of avoided energy, and about 20 to 30% of the savings comes from avoided capacity costs. But I want to note, this is just Texas, right? What about the rest of the country? Well, in addition to Texas, we studied 4 additional grid regions: the Southeast, the Midwest, California, and the Pacific Northwest. This slide shows the geographic extent of those grid regions, along with the annual energy savings in 2030. Those are the numbers in the light blue bars, and in 2050. Those are the numbers in the green bars. And all those numbers are provided in units of millions of megawatt hours of energy savings. This figure offers another comparison across regions where, again, the length of each bar represents the total avoided annual electricity system costs achieved by our set of energy efficiency measures and packages. Each region has 4 bars with the 2 commercial on top and the 2 residential on bottom. And you'll notice that in every region, commercial savings are greater than residential savings in 2030. And in all regions except California, residential savings are greater than commercial savings in 2050. And again, these results are for a future in which power sector emissions drop 95% by 2050. But what would happen if the electricity system decarbonizes faster than that? What if we were able to reduce emissions 95% by 2035 and 100% by 2050? How would that change things? Well, this figure can help answer that question. The vertical axis here represents the marginal wholesale cost of energy in dollars per megawatt hour across our 5 regions, with each region denoted by color. The dashed lines represent our faster renewable energy scenario, that is 95% reduction in emissions by 2035, while the solid lines represent our slower renewable energy scenario, 95 by 2050. Notice how the avoided energy costs are actually fairly similar in both 2030 and 2050, regardless of how quickly renewable energy is deployed. What's really interesting is what happens in the years between 2030 and 2050. we see that the energy costs in the faster renewable energy scenario start ramping upward in 2030, then they plateau around 2040. In comparison, the avoided energy costs in the slower renewable energy scenario don't really start ramping up until around 2040. And what this suggests is that energy efficiency is likely to be more valuable in avoiding total electricity system costs under a more rapid supply-side decarbonization scenario. In other words, if you're in a grid region where renewable energy is coming online more quickly, energy efficiency will be more valuable in your region than in other regions. So let me just wrap up with some conclusions and recommendations. First, we cannot let our foot off the accelerator when it comes to energy efficiency. Efficiency has a critical role to play in enabling a high renewable energy future, but it is going to take decades to fully realize efficiency's potential due to the slow turnover rate of inefficient equipment within residential and commercial buildings. So, as a result, we need to be getting buildings ready now. Building owners and operators should be educated about efficient technologies before it is time for replacement, so that any steps that need to be taken in advance of their purchase and installation can be taken. The second recommendation is for energy efficiency program designers to put more emphasis on measures that will reduce space conditioning loads. This includes improving insulation in walls, attics, basements, crawl spaces, rim joists. It means more air sealing and more smart thermostats. In some circumstances, it may mean better windows, and it means replacing inefficient electric heating like baseboard heating with electric heat pumps. The reality, of course, is that heat pumps and building weatherization improvements are not free, and we cannot leave low-income customers behind in the transition. So that means utilities will need to be more creative about braiding their own ratepayer-funded efficiency programs with other sources of funding, including the billions of dollars of incentives that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act. Third recommendation, don't forget the commercial sector. There are huge potential savings in retail buildings, offices, warehouses, etc., especially within the next 10 to 20 years. Fourth, accelerate the deployment of electric heat pump water heaters. There are huge potential savings associated with this measure. And finally, even though the avoided energy costs aren't as high, don't forget the other sources of energy efficiency savings that can come from refrigeration, dryers, dishwashers, and other measures like that we listed on that slide earlier. All right, so I'll be happy to take your questions, as Edward mentioned during the Q&A, but here's my email address if you'd like to reach out after the webinar. And with that, Edward, throw it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that presentation, Mike. We will now just move on to Paul Ormond's presentation. Paul, if you'd like to give us your remarks.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I don't have a deck. I like to speak about some of our experience here in Massachusetts. We are Climate Zone 5. Just by the way, again, my name's Paul. I'm with the Department of Energy Resources here in the state of Massachusetts. We're the State Energy Office, and one of our roles is building decarbonization. So maybe that's a good segue overall to maybe go one step deeper into discussing how we do energy efficiency. We achieve energy efficiency in building standards through use of codes. And the codes that are typically used across the US are based on IECC and ASHRAE standards. From our perspective, when we look at energy efficiency and those standards, we see that the energy efficiency codes embodied in IECC and ASHRAE could be a lot better. There's a lot more that can be done in the model codes by IECC and ASHRAE than what we're doing now. Now, it's interesting, as we've been on our decarbonization journey and codes journey here in the state of Massachusetts, we do come across pockets of people here and there that I think that maybe the attitude is that the ASHRAE and IECC codes are about as good as they're going to get. And maybe there's some adjustments that can be made, et cetera. But I think that that's almost fed into some thinking that let's build to these codes and let's put PV on the roof, try to get to net zero, and we'll, declare victory. And I actually get concerned about that line of thinking because it sounds really good to have, net zero codes and things of that nature, but it inadvertently lets codes off the hook because it suggests that, we're as good as we can get and there's not a lot more we can do. So that kind of track, that to me, that's kind of the business as usual track that we're kind of going down unless we take really strong actions. That's a major missed opportunity. So what is it about the codes that they're not addressing well now? I would say that the number one deficiency in IECC and ASHRAE codes as they're currently written is that they don't reduce space heating demand. That space heating demand in particular can be reduced a whole lot more than you get with the current codes. In particular, if you focus on lower air infiltration and you have better thermal bridge mitigation and much higher ventilation energy recovery, you can reduce building heating loads by 50 to 90%. Now, ASHRAE and IECC, they've made some progress in these particular items, particularly air filtration finally has good provisions in IECC, including on-site testing, so that's a big win. But they're really not doing well in kind of the other items here. This is a sort of trifecta. They're doing well in low air filtration, but still not doing well in thermal bridges and improving ventilation energy recovery. So getting 2 out of the 3 things in the trifecta. Now you might wonder how IECC and ASHRAE stands with the thermal bridge provisions that are being proposed. We've taken a look at those, and there's still a lot left on the table, even in the IECC 2024 thermal bridge provisions. There's a whole lot more that can be done to better address thermal bridges than what's being proposed. And ventilation energy recovery standards could certainly be much, much higher. But the thing that's most concerning, and I think this hasn't gotten enough discussion, is most states adopt IECC and ASHRAE as a package. And ASHRAE is basically designed with its 90.1 appendix to allow designers to trade off envelope performance in an almost unlimited fashion. And one thing that we've learned here is that that's not necessarily a good strategy if you're trying to reduce heating loads. So we want to make sure that we actually put limits on how much envelope performance can be traded off. So why is it that we're so focused on this trifecta, and why are we so focused on envelope performance? What we've learned is that when you keep heating demand loads low, it allows you to easily swap from fossil fuel space heating to electric heat pump space heating without having to increase peak electric loads for most building types. And for some building types, that's not possible when you make that swap. But when you do get the heating demands down low, that swap, although it increases the peak electric demand, it's increased by just a very modest amount. So in other words, it allows us to sort of unlock building electrification across the board without putting unnecessary extra additional load on our electric grid. If we do sort of business as usual codes, which don't address well space heating, then we're putting a lot of unnecessary stress and a lot of unnecessary cost onto our electric grid infrastructure. And as an added bonus, when we build buildings that have low space heating, we're also getting buildings that are much more resilient, much more comfortable, and use much less HVAC equipment. So you might wonder, why is this opportunity being missed? So in the circles that write ASHRAE codes and write IECC codes, why hasn't everyone come to this conclusion? And my theory on this is that we've long been measuring the wrong thing. And that is when we do policy evaluations or even building designs, the question usually is, what is my total energy use of this building and how am I getting that to be lower? What percentage EUI reduction am I achieving? And when you look at things from that metric, you sometimes can kind of miss important details. So for example, if I have a scenario where I do improve envelope, I do have low air infiltration, if I do have high levels of ventilation energy recovery, and I look at the effect on total EUI of an office building, you'll find that the effect is very small. It might only improve EUI by 5%. And so a design team or policymakers might come to the conclusion that those are maybe low priority items. And in fact, when you deploy those strategies, although the EUI might only be modestly improved, the space heating load in an office building, climate zone 5 that we're in, is reduced by 90%. And again, that means that we can swap from gas space heating to electric space heating in an office building with no increase to our peak electric load. So we've been kind of measuring the wrong thing, and we need to shift what we the metrics of success that we've been using. So here in Massachusetts, what we've done is we've adopted the IECC and ACEEE codes as our foundational codes as a starting point, but we've added to them thermal bridge provisions, which I think close the gap on what they've been missing. Much better air infiltration provisions. We also have better ventilation energy recovery provisions, but also importantly, we also limit the amount of envelope trade-off that's allowed. And that package then we know delivers buildings with low peak loads. Now, you might think that sounds kind of familiar, that strategy. This is what we call the thermal code strategy, focusing on heating and cooling loads rather than just focusing on overall EUI. So this thermal code strategy, this is not new. This is something that Passive House has been doing for decades. And we know from their decades of experience and literally tens of thousands of very successful Passive House buildings around the world, the thermal code approach really works. And so what we see as the next step in the evolution of codes is taking the thermal code approach and bringing it into IECC and ACEEE, and bringing those ideas and kind of taking Passive House success to the masses, right? That's what we see as the next step. So in summary, thermal codes that focus on heating load reduction, particularly low air infiltration, thermal bridge mitigation, ventilation energy recovery, and elimination of unlimited envelope trade-offs. That's really the critical kind of recipe for decarbonization. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much for that, Paul. Those are some really great insights about the thermal code approach. And now we'll move on to Dr. Harris. Choki? I'm sorry, Choke, would you take it away? Choke, if you're, yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thanks everyone, and thanks Edward for the introduction. My name again is Choke Harris. I'm a senior research engineer here at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in our Building Technologies and Science Center. Today, I'm going to talk through results from a couple of different studies to kind of bookend what Paul and Mike talked about with touching on codes and touching on strategies for and the importance of efficiency in the context of grid decarbonization. A lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today builds on the ResStock and Comstock models. So for those who aren't familiar, Restock and Comstock are models of the residential and commercial building stocks in the US. They are statistical representations of the stock based on a huge variety of data sources that characterize the underlying stock characteristics of buildings in the US today. We draw from a wide variety of public and private data sources to compile the representation of that building stock. We sample from those descriptions of the characteristics of the stock, and these characteristics are enormously wide-ranging. They include things like wall insulation levels, attic and finished ceiling insulation levels, HVAC system configuration, efficiency, ductwork configuration, all manner of characteristics of the building that influence energy use. We model the buildings that are characterized by the samples that we generate for residential and commercial buildings. And for many cases, we also look at changes to those samples. If we apply upgrades, efficiency upgrades to those buildings or electrification upgrades to those buildings, how does that change their energy use patterns? And then we publish a wide range of data from those simulations. So individual building level, time series data, all the way to roll-ups at the national or state level, and kind of everything in between. I'm going to touch on a bunch of different studies, and I'm going to do it kind of quickly because of relatively limited time. So I'm going to jump through several different studies with very little background and methodology. All the slides include links to the study reports and executive summaries. I encourage folks to take a look at those for a little late bedtime reading. It's very relaxing, reviewing technical reports and understanding better the methodologies we use to derive some of these results. This slide and the next slide I'm going to show are based on a study that NREL did called LA100, which was an examination of how the city of LA might get to a future in which their whole energy system for the city is fully decarbonized by 2045. So that's from generation all the way through to all the different end uses in the city. We explored a lot of different trajectories for each of the demand side sectors as well as the supply side to understand how different decisions, availability of incentives, potential to expand transmission and distribution, all of these different possibilities might interact with each other to influence overall carbon emission reductions, overall cost savings, et cetera. So we looked at all those different scenarios. I'm going to talk here about the demand side and particularly the scenarios that we considered on the demand side. We looked at 3 different scenarios, what we called moderate, high, and stress. Those scenarios represent, in a moderate case, a reasonably aggressive, but not sort of maximally aggressive pursuit of electrification and energy efficiency on the demand side, whereas high is hitting kind of full decarbonization of the demand side sectors by 2045. And then stress is a case where we do full decarbonization, but with less efficiency. And so critically, if we compare the high case, which is both aggressive efficiency coupled with aggressive electrification versus the stress case, which is just that electrification piece with sort of business as usual or slightly better than business as usual efficiency, you get significant reductions, in this case, about 10% in total annual electricity demand when we look at residential and commercial buildings in aggregate. And that's significant and sort of increasing over time. That gap sort of widens as the stock turns over, as you transition to a more and more electrified system. Focusing again on that same study, looking at LA100 results for those 3 scenarios, looking out to 2045, that kind of 100% target year. And in this case, looking at peak electricity demand, as opposed to the previous slide, which was annual electricity use. And in this case, again, about 10% reduction comparing that high scenario to the stress scenario. So efficiency, again, offers pretty significant on-peak benefits. It's a little bit tricky in this particular figure to compare them because the peak times actually shift, which is a function of what is enabled in the high versus stress scenarios with respect to load flexibility and other factors and considerations. So it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison in this particular figure, but kind of across the board, we see significant reductions in peak demand and in that peak season from adopting efficiency alongside aggressive electrification. I'm going to switch gears now. I mentioned I was going to switch through a bunch of different analyses. These data are from the end-use savings shapes residential results. And I'll talk in a couple of slides more about end-use savings shapes in that data set or data resource. This figure is showing a week. Each box here is showing a week of data. And those are from 5 different scenarios running from left to right, going from our baseline case, the sort of existing building stock and energy use in the stock, across to 4 different upgrade scenarios. So looking at, as those titles show, electrification with minimum efficiency equipment, electrification with high efficiency equipment, that same high efficiency electrification plus envelope upgrades, so not just upgrading the equipment, but doing an envelope upgrade as well. And then all the way to the right is the most aggressive envelope case. So not just doing sort of like basic duct sealing and that kind of stuff, basic attic insulation, but actually doing much more aggressive air sealing and insulation upgrades. So as I mentioned, each of these plots shows a week of data, and we're showing 2 different seasons. On the top is the winter season, a week in February, and on the bottom is the summer season, a week in July. What I really want to highlight here is the effect of electrification on the load shape. So all of that kind of orange and red that you're seeing, those big spikes, those are driven by heating demand. So we've transitioned the stock to, and this is in Colorado, so we transitioned the stock in Colorado, which is kind of climate zones 4 through 7, depending on where you are in the state, to electric equipment, but again, minimum efficiency equipment. These are sort of relatively modest efficiency heat pumps in a lot of cases. There's a lot of dependence on backup heating. As you transition to higher efficiency equipment, particularly when you bring in envelope upgrades, you see a significant reduction in the peak, a significant reduction in dependence on backup heat, which has knock-on effects in bill savings and kind of overall system savings, benefits to the electric grid, and makes doing things like electrification from the standpoint of your system operator or your utility, it makes that a lot less burdensome. I'll also note that this also has benefits for resilience as well. And the analysis that we've done, looking at cold climates in particular, doing those envelope upgrades really has an enormous resilience benefit in case you do have system outages or service disruptions. That really provides a safety benefit. It's true as well in hot climates. The benefit is maybe a little bit smaller, but you can get pretty significant benefits. And in warm climates, you can get benefits like doing window upgrades, which may enable you to operate the windows. They may otherwise be painted shut, and having operable windows and access to natural ventilation in case of a system outage can be enormously beneficial from a safety standpoint. Switching gears again, this is an analysis that we did looking specifically at the city of Chicago, targeting specifically disadvantaged communities, communities with historic disinvestment, and understanding what housing types are most common in those communities, and what strategies might deliver bill savings and overall energy savings as we move through kind of basic. We look at 3 different upgrade packages here. Efficiency upgrades, but without electrification, and then 2 tiers of electrification or kind of increasing electrification. I want to highlight particularly packages 2 and 3, where we're going. In both cases, we have kind of this comprehensive set of efficiency upgrades. In package 2, we're doing a heat pump upgrade, but no additional electrification. In package 3, we're doing full electrification that includes, an induction range, heat pump water heater, all those key upgrades across end uses that are reliant on fossil fuels. And notably, we get energy savings that persist across and increase across those 2 packages. So each of the ranges, the inner quartile range, so the 25th to 75th percentile of the houses in each row, the stock type in each row. And we also, looking at bill savings, get significant bill savings, and those savings persist as you move from some electrification, but still dependence on natural gas for some end uses, to full electrification. Under current rate conditions, you see those savings, those bill savings persist across those categories. So I'm going to switch gears again to talk a little bit about data resources very briefly. I want to highlight a couple of data resources that we've published that folks can use and take advantage of. The first is end use load profiles. That was a product that concluded, I believe, in 2019 or 2020. And that work was really focused on generating load profiles, so 15-minute interval data representing the characteristics of the load shape from the building stock as it exists today. We're continuing to extend that work with a project called End Use Saving Shapes, which is a series of data releases that are ongoing for both the residential and commercial building stocks, looking at these sort of what if scenarios, trying to understand how different individual upgrades and packages of upgrades will change load shapes when they're applied on top of the existing building stock. In terms of the end use saving shapes data, as well as the end use profiles data, those data are available in a couple of different avenues, actually several different avenues. If you want to access the data files themselves, you can access those through the Open Energy Data Initiative or OpenEI. That data resource includes building model metadata and annual energy use results. They include pre-aggregated time series data files. So that's time series data grouped by state, by climate zone, et cetera, on a 15-minute interval. We did that. We created those pre-set aggregations to provide files that can be opened in Excel and perform reasonably well. And then we also include the individual time series data as well. So if you want to get time series data for each individual home that was modeled or each individual building that was modeled, you can pull those data as well from ODI and take advantage of those using your preferred data processing tool. We also offer a web data viewer that allows both viewing of the results in a variety of different ways, as well as aggregation and downloading of those data. So once you have a view that you sort of like or a perspective that you like, you can download those data and take advantage of that. Finally, I want to touch briefly on opportunities for partnership and collaboration in getting support to leverage some of these data resources. You can partner directly with the national labs. You're welcome to reach out to PIs if you see a data set that you like and you'd like to work more closely with that team, by all means. Not just NREL, any of the national labs would be happy to work with you. There are also opportunities to work with the national labs through other funding mechanisms. There's both prizes, and I want to highlight particularly the Buildings Upgrade Prize. That link will be available, and you can also just Google, if you Google Buildings Upgrade Prize, you'll find links to the prize opportunity. The phase 1 deadline is July 18th, so there's still opportunities to apply for that prize. That includes technical support or technical assistance that would allow you to work with the labs with some of these data sets customized to your individual region or locality. And then there's also more traditional funding opportunities through ERE Exchange to potentially submit for funding from DOE under a variety of different mechanisms to pursue building specific research. I'll pause there, and that's my contact information if you'd like to reach out.
Great, thank you so much, Choke. We really appreciate that. Okay, then we'll just get to the questions. As you can see, there are a couple dozen questions. I'm certainly not sure that we'll be able to get to them all, but if we don't, we will do our best to at least type them out after the webinar, and we'll circulate that as part of the transcript. So we'll do our best to get to all of these questions, but I'll certainly highlight a few that I'm using the moderator's privilege that caught my attention and ask each of the presenters a couple of the questions. So I guess we'll just go in the order, starting with Mike. The question that came in, the several that came in, but the one that I like to begin with is that the questioner asked, wondering if you have a sense of how your results might change under a supply side scenario that achieves full 100% decarbonization, given that the previous research has shown that last 5% of power sector decarb is particularly costly. In parentheses, and I believe there's now a Cambium 100% by 2035 scenario available.
Yeah, it's a good question. And really what we were trying to get at with this report, yes, it is true that Cambium has each year will develop and add new scenarios. The scenario that this question references came in after we had already finalized our research results, so we weren't able to look at it. But I think this opens up the opportunity to discuss what at least I found to be a little intuitively or unintuitive at the beginning of the process. Because when we were thinking about the future role of energy efficiency, we were thinking about how the cost of renewable energy is going down. And if renewable energy costs continue to decrease and we pluck a lot of the low-hanging fruit from energy efficiency, leaving the harder and more expensive efficiency behind, is efficiency still competitive? And as the question alludes to, and what we saw when we were examining the avoided energy and capacity costs within Cambium, is that as more renewable energy comes onto the grid, as you get closer to 100% decarbonization, we're looking at 95% decarbonization scenarios. That last 5% is actually really tricky to decarbonize. And it gets decarbonized with a combination of fossil plants, carbon capture and sequestration, and battery storage. And so what we see are there's actually two trends that are in play at the same time. The first is that on a regular basis, sort of normal operating conditions, renewable energy costs go down, but the cost of meeting that last 5% actually starts to go way up. And when you net those two things out hour by hour and apply the energy savings that can be delivered hour by hour, you found that the electricity system, perhaps counterintuitively, actually becomes more expensive as we get to higher levels of decarbonization. So to answer the question more directly, my impression would be that the faster a system tries to get to 100% renewable energy, the more expensive it is going to be, because scaling the resources necessary to meet that final few percent in a decarbonized manner reliably becomes much more expensive. And so I think that's the direction it would end up going.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that response. Another one that I'll just sort of throw your way, Mike, is the one on EVs. So the questioner is asking, how does the transition to EVs might affect your predictions or your results?
Yeah, it's a good point that I didn't mention EVs. It's an astute observation that EVs were not mentioned in the presentation. We basically assume in our modeling the same level of electrification that is present in the EIA's annual energy outlook. And for those who aren't familiar with the annual energy outlook, that means not much. AEO typically has what I would consider to be kind of a conservative view of the future. If you look at the amount of natural gas and coal that they assume will exist in 2050, it's higher than a lot of states are pushing for, and it's certainly a lot higher than would be needed to meet our 100% decarbonization goals. So our level of energy efficiency, our level of electrification across all technologies is consistent with AEO. What I will note is that the more electrical load there is, the easier it is to make the case for energy efficiency because there is more load that can be reduced. We intentionally chose to look at a low electrification case because it is actually more challenging for energy efficiency to demonstrate its value under those conditions. Even under those conditions, we still demonstrated that there are billions of dollars of value in avoided electricity system cost in each grid region in each year by 2050. So I would assume that if we added more electrification on board, those savings would only go up. With the caveat, of course, that for electric vehicles, it's a lot less about energy efficiency at the building itself, and it's more about managed charging and making sure that the EVs charge up at the right hours as opposed to EVs using less energy. The energy efficiency aspects surrounding transportation actually exist to active transportation, walking, biking, public transit, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and it's a whole digression I don't want to get into. But hopefully that answers the question on how we dealt with electrification.
Yeah, and just a last one for you. So and I think this question really came in pretty much right out of the gate, as soon as you're talking about the ambition gap, which is that really considering how many years leading states for energy efficiency take to ramp up their programs, do we need quick start programs to become the norm for states that do not have active EE programs?
Well, I think it goes without saying that when it comes to efficiency, faster is better. The faster you can get benefits into the hands of customers, including a whole host of non-energy benefits that we don't even have time to get into, but it also gives benefits to the grid right off the bat. I will note, however, that there is a path forward where we don't have to have accelerated replacements of inefficient building technologies. Again, in our modeling, we assume that when, for example, your furnace ends the end of its normal lifetime, or your hot water heater after its 15 years of operation conks out, that is the time when the efficient equipment replacement takes place. We do not need to assume that we snap our fingers and magically every piece of equipment becomes the most efficient piece of equipment tomorrow in order to demonstrate these benefits. Even if people just make individually an energy efficient decision at the point of replacement, you still get these billions of dollars of electricity system benefits, even without quick start programs. But the faster, of course, we can do it, the better.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'll move on to Paul. Few of the questions that came your way. I mean, they're really fascinating concepts like the thermal code ideas. So I'm going to try to merge a couple of these ideas, which is that, so what resistance might you expect in moving to a sort of a thermal code similar to the passive house standard that you referenced? And could you share some thoughts about how we might overcome that kind of resistance?
That's a great question. One of the key things that's important when you roll out a thermal code kind of world that we discovered is that it's really important to make sure everyone remembers all the interactive things and the externalities. So just as a super simple example, if you have a scenario of looking at building A has your normal envelope performance, building B has better envelope performance. What a lot of designers and, what will often happen is that people will simply look at the additional cost of going to the better envelope performance. And then you encounter a lot of resistance because it's like, hey, this doesn't justify, in and of itself. But when you go a step deeper, especially when you do things in combination, and this is why I always talk about these as a trifecta. If you're improving the envelope, or at least making sure it doesn't get traded off performance-wise, addressing thermal breaks, ventilation energy recovery, these things as a package, what you find is that you can make your HVAC systems smaller. And so then the additional cost is actually a net cost. It's not just the cost of better envelope, better ventilation and recovery. It's those costs, but it's then minus the fact that you don't need the distribution systems to the perimeters for all your heating and cooling systems, which is a huge cost in a commercial building. So as you embark on unrolling programs like this, it's very important to study kind of all the externalities that you might encounter, all the interactivities, if that's a word, that you might encounter, and look at scenarios of, if we improve this, what other items might be more economical than we're used to. And it's a harder thing than you think, because HVAC designers, for example, the size of the boiler plant and the distributed perimeter radiation is always, so many dollars per square feet. So you actually have to go through a process of redesigning those things under the premise of better envelope performance. We call this principle an envelope you can count on, right? If you address thermal bridging, et cetera, you're going to get an envelope you can count on, and you can take away some of the factors of safety that HVAC designers have used to eliminate those costs, make those systems more lean. So those are the kind of things that help overcome resistance to thermal codes, to look at the whole universe that you're interacting with.
Yeah. Well, this is a follow-up. So I mean, you began your talk by talking about we were measuring the wrong thing and just going and thinking about EUI. So if we were to really measure the right thing, then how might, in Massachusetts, do you see, are the utility incentives already aligned with measuring the right thing? Or do we still need to work on aligning the utility incentives so that it can help the building sector just maximize the benefits?
It's a mix. There's a lot more we can do. So there's in Massachusetts, there's a lot of utility incentives that are explicitly tied to EUI reductions. or they're tied to reductions in total therms used and or total kilowatts used and or total BTU. So it's sort of all the same thing. So effectively not tied to the more narrow focused of the heating reduction. So a lot of incentives are still set up that way. So we have a lot of progress we need to make. At the same time, the utility programs, at least here in Massachusetts, have actually accelerated incentives and programs for things like passive house that are giving direct benefits to passive house projects, which passive house is a thermal code. So we have a mix here in our state. Some incentives that are playing well with thermal codes, some incentives that are still sort of old school. So hopefully continuing to move in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Paul. Moving to Choke. Choke, there's a questioner who asked, what do you make of what appears to be small or minimal differences between the basic enclosure and the enhanced enclosure, and the enhanced enclosure upgrades for winter season heating profiles? Is that a case of diminishing returns for further enclosure upgrades?
That's a great question. Actually, I had to go back and look at what was included in those two packages to remind myself. It's actually, I think the biggest thing is the basic enclosure package is not as basic as I had realized. So it includes drill and fill insulation for homes with wood stud walls. It includes aggressive attic insulation, so bring it up to current code levels. It includes air sealing across the board, as well as duct sealing and duct insulating. So it's a pretty robust basic package. And then the enhanced enclosure package goes above and beyond that. But because that basic package includes some of the kind of heaviest hitters in terms of savings, the additional savings available in the enhanced enclosure package are more limited. And the level of aggressiveness is relatively small. It's only touching a couple more points in the performance of the existing envelope.
Yeah, okay. Just sort of another question, just more on the details of your analysis. So in the Chicago assessment, is the savings compared to the previous heating with electric resistance or compared to gas heating?
Yeah, so it's compared to, like everything in ResDec and ComStack, it's compared to the characteristics of the underlying stock. And in Chicago, it's predominantly natural gas. Critically, as we looked at the transitions from the basic package, which included upgrades in the efficiency of the fuel-fired equipment to higher efficiency fuel-fired equipment, to moving to electrification of HVAC and then electrification of all systems, you actually get a pretty significant savings that trades off potentially small increases in bills on the electricity side with the fact that you're now no longer, you can disconnect your gas service. And so you get savings from the reduction in fixed costs from your gas bill, and that kind of offsets maybe a small increase so that you net out pretty nicely for a lot of homes.
Yeah. This is, so I mean, I think we just have pretty much just questions for one more, and I guess I'll just really pick the last comment or the last question that came in, which is that, so I think this is really starting with you, Paul. So the model energy codes, the questioner is asking, commenting that model energy codes are stuck on traditional limited scope of cost benefit study. So is there any plan to provide guidance on how to include the externalities and interactions such that the full scope of cost benefits can be better understood?
Well, I wish we had time to to work on just this. I mean, what we have looked at when we did our work here in Massachusetts, we did write a report which we can share with everyone that looked at all the externalities, including effect on grid and things of that nature. So we're not able to provide guidance in some guidance document, but we can provide an example, and perhaps that might be a good starting point. But yeah, I think this is a really important point, that policy decisions about what should and shouldn't be in code has generally been, if I do X, how much does my benefit my bill? And that's just not good enough evaluation. We have to look at all the externalities, including impact on grid. And why not also look at benefits of resilience and comfort that we're also achieving as well?
Okay. Just really the last question. I suspect that this is for all of the panelists. Then I suspect that this may be a simple answer, but let's see. So do you all agree that if you reverse the order of upgrades and do electrification before envelope upgrades, that the savings will be hampered? Probably give it a thumb up or down vote.
I can actually answer that question very quickly by letting people know that we wrote, ACEEE published a blog post just last week on the benefits that envelope improvements applied for electrification, and we have a longer policy brief that will answer that very question. The short answer is that there are a subset of buildings in the country for which, if they have inefficient heating systems and you electrify to a heat pump, they will save money immediately. There's a lot of other buildings, though, that if they have like high efficient natural gas burners, electrification on its own will not save energy, and you'll need to do an envelope retrofit first in order to deliver those savings. That is especially true in cold climates, places like New England, places like Minnesota. And if you really want to dive into this, look at the work of Minnesota CEE, Josh Quinnell's work in particular, who modeled what needs to happen to transform the Minneapolis building stock. And I think that gives you a great answer to that question.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you. I think that covers that. You knocked that out of the park. So I think that's it. We're just a minute over. Thank you for staying with us. And again, we will, for all of the attendees, you will get a transcript and a recording of this webinar, along with all of the presentations that were given. And we will do our best to answer all of the unanswered questions as a text format. So with that, we'll adjourn, and thank you so much to all of the presenters. That was really excellent. And thank you to all of the attendees for spending this time with us.